Hello, this is Mrs. Cliffner, and I just want to get to the second part, the last part of lesson 3.3. Well, it's lesson 28. And the idea is that I kind of had to rush through the lesson a little bit because there's a lot to show you in this flip chart. And so these three properties, the addition property of 0, the multiplication property of 1, and the multiplication property of 0, you guys really know these already. You just maybe haven't seen the name associated with the idea. And I want you to know that this is called the identity property for addition. This is the identity property for multiplication. And by identity, I mean it's who you are, right? Your identity is not changing just because you are going to school at home, right? My identity is not changing. I'm still the teacher, but I'm teaching from home. And so the idea is if I add 0 to any number, the number doesn't change. If I multiply any number by 1, the number doesn't change. But when I multiply anything by 0, it wipes out everything, right? So the identity, that 7 that I started with, definitely changes because it gets reduced to 0. And so these two properties you're going to use, well, these three properties you'll be using a lot in algebra later on this year and also next year. And so now I want to show you some examples. If you're asked to simplify the expression 9 times 0 times p, notice the first thing I'm going to do is notice that the 9 and the 0 are next to each other, but when I put parentheses around them, I am using the associative property, right? So I'm going to move this over and show you that this would be the associative property of multiplication. And then when I actually go and I multiply the 0 times the 9, that equals 0. That's that multiplication property of 0 that I told you about. So when I actually multiply the 9 and 0 together, I can do that, and I know the answer is 0 because there's a multiplication property of 0 that tells me that. And then the whole thing equals 0. So now I've got a second example that says simplify this expression. And notice when I get to the simplified expression, there's still an r in there, right? Everything didn't get wiped out like with the 0. So I'm going to multiply 4.5 times r times 1. But the first thing I want to do is I know I want the 4.5 next to the 1, but I want to make my first group. And my first group is just going to be the r with the 1 because I have to group something together. And so I use the associative property and I group the r and 1 together. And then I know, oh, that's right. Anything times 1 is still that number. So now when I use the multiplication property of 1, that's the justification that tells me that r times 1 is r. I don't know what r is, but my last step is just to multiply 4.5 times r, and I'm rewriting it without the dot. So all I'm doing is I'm rewriting and making equivalent expressions. And I can't do the math unless I know what the variables equal. So now I'm going to show you a couple more examples that I wanted to do in class but didn't have a chance to do. Okay, so there's this example, and this example. So notice if I have 12 times b times 0, what changes in the next line is the 0 and the b switch position. Remember, they are commoving, so that's the commutative property, which and the operation is multiplication. So I just use the commutative property of multiplication to rewrite it. And then you can see what happened is I did this part next. Just going to move this over so it stays. I did 12 times 0 equals 0, right? Anytime you multiply something by 0, it's using the multiplication property of 0. So I'm going to put this in as my next, how I can justify that step. And then, of course, again, now I'm going to multiply the 0 times the b. And when I do that, I am also using the multiplication property. Oops, I put of 1. Sorry about that. That's the multiplication property of 0, which is here. And then I'm using the multiplication property of 0 again to get 0 as my final answer. Okay, and number 5, I want to multiply 1 times m times 24, but I want the 1 and the 24 to be next to each other. So I'm going to use the commutative, right? I'm going to move the 1 and the m. When I move the 1 and the m, that's my first step. And I can do that because we know there's the commutative property of multiplication. And then when I think about multiplying the 1 times the 24, I actually could use the associative property next, but I can see that 1 times 24 is 24. It's the identity property of 1, or the multiplication property of 1, because it doesn't change the number 24 when I multiply by 1. So I just use the multiplication property of 1. And then last thing is I'm just rewriting it. I always like to write the coefficient. Remember I taught you that word coefficient, or the multiplier. I usually write the multiplier before the variable in all of my answers. So 24 times m is the same thing as m times 24, but this way looks better. Okay, the last example, notice the t and the 15 are associated, but then in the next row, the 15 and the 0 are associated, right? So we're looking to see what's been changed. The groups have been changed, and it's addition. So I know that it's the associative property of addition allows me to rewrite this step. And now when I add 15 plus 0 to get 15, I know that this is when you're adding 0 to anything, it doesn't change the number. So I know it's the addition property of 0. And I can't do anything more than that. I'm being asked to simplify, and that's as simple as I can get. Okay, so now this was the Google form that I had for you. And in this Google form, when you go through and look at problems, I want you to notice things first. I want you to notice the order first. 2, 3, 4, 2, 4, 3. Oops, order. The order change. Commutative, right? So I'm already thinking that it has to be something to do with commutative. When I'm multiplying by 1, I'm thinking, oh, hey, it's something like the multiplication property of 1. When I'm multiplying by 0, it's the multiplication property of 0. Again, on this one, I check the order. This is 4 times 5, and this is 5 times 4. So I'm thinking it has to do with the commutative property. And then I check number 5. I check the order 3, 4, 5. 3, 4, 5. The order didn't change, so now I look for the parentheses. I can see that 4 and 5 are associated here, and 3 and 4 are associated here. So this one has to do with the associative property. But then, of course, you have to tell me if it's addition or multiplication. And then I'm going to do the same thing here and check the order. 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2. Order didn't change, so it's not the commutative. And I look at the parentheses. 4 and 2 are together, 3 and 4 together. So I'm going to guess that this one has to do with the associative property. And then you add in the part where it's either multiplication or addition. So that's just a little extra help on the last 3 properties that we took notes on today.